Okay. Okay. Here we go. So welcome to Coaching Conversations 2, and this is side by side grief and gratitude. Can they exist? Can they live together? That is the burning question, and some of you may already know the answer. But I hope today we can have a conversation around this. There is no kind of right or wrong here. So let's go to the next slide. This is my disclaimer. We'll just go ahead and get started. And just want to welcome you all back to the virtual coaching cottage. And just wanted to see, since our last session together, if anyone wanted to share any insights or anything they thought about in terms of that identifying a fresh start. Did anyone have a fresh start? Did anyone explore the wellness wheel any further, or think about a well life statement or vision? Any thoughts kind of bubble up since the last time we met? Feel free to share. I'm just gonna give everyone, okay. Okay, so we'll just keep going. So again, I love to frame our sessions with the idea of using the curiosity strength, the discovery strength, the growth mindset, the idea of connection, and how all of this together can kind of push forward and pave the way for hope. So for today, I asked everyone to bring your favorite candle if you felt like it. And this would be the time where we would kind of light the candle together and kind of just use this candle as a way to symbolize today's conversation, to honor today's conversation. It's a ritual, of course. And really, I'm a firm believer of not underestimating the power of a small ritual. It doesn't have to be anything huge. I think it boosts focus. It can kind of evoke peace. It can provide centering, can be motivating. And really, it can just be a demarcation of time, our time together, and how special that is. So I went ahead and lit my candle. And for those of you that didn't bring one, I'll light this one for you. And so, oh, let's see, Stacy. Oh, look who it is, Ruth. That is a great candle. That's awesome. Okay, Ruth's with us today. So let's explore grief. We'll explore gratitude and self-compassion. We'll share, and this will be a conversation, so please chime in. Feel free to unmute yourself and just express yourself. So let's get started with this idea of, can we feel two opposing emotions at the same time? And sometimes it's called ambivalence, which is often confused with indifference. And culturally, we do have a bias, I think, towards wanting to sort out our feelings into feeling either A or B, but not both. And so the desire to want to be in one camp or one kind of way of feeling, I think is pretty strong. And I love this quote by F. Scott Fitzgerald, who believed that a capacity for ambivalence indicated intellectual ability. He says the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. So Freud saw emotional ambivalence. So if you think about feeling grief and gratitude at the same time as an intrinsic part of the human condition, and more the modern research is now supporting this notion as well. And so it really jives, I think, with Rumi's Guest House, which I've shared before, but I think it bears repeating. Oops, didn't mean to go to Charlie Brown yet. So the Guest House, we can read together and kind of just see how those two or multiple feelings and emotions kind of interplay throughout life. This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. So it brings us to Charlie Brown and grief, right? And I don't know about you, and maybe I'm dating myself, but as a kid, I always heard the expression good grief, right? And I always thought, is grief, so grief must be good, right? So grief must not be bad, despite the sarcasm here, right? So let's think about grief in terms of something normal and intrinsic, as you know, we talked about. And so our lens for today is really about viewing grief practices and gratitude practices as vital tools in your wellness portfolio. So things that you can call upon, things that you have in your arsenal. And we can start by just kind of talking about grief, you know, pretty generally. And the Hospice Foundation of America defines grief as a reaction to loss, any loss. And how we grieve can be as personalized as our fingerprint. You know, which basically says everybody grieves so different and in different ways at different paces. We know that grief is not linear. And Matthew Radcliffe, a professor at the University of York in England, said grief is an emotional response to loss. And so we most commonly as a culture associate grief with death. But what about all the other losses, big and small? So for today, we will focus on grief as it relates to any and all types of loss. And so I ask you to kind of bring out your journal now, and really the idea about naming it to tame it, right? Or doodling something or visualizing, and just jot whatever comes to mind when you hear the word grief. It can just be one word, it doesn't have to be anything profound, but really just what comes up for you when you hear the word grief. And I'll give us about 30 seconds to do that. Okay, does anyone want to share what one word or what picture comes to mind? And you know, when we talk about grief in this way, we're kind of taking the dull edge off a little bit of the word, right? We're normalizing it, we're making it normal. We're normalizing that grief should be part of our life. Does anybody want to share? I can start. And when I hear the word grief, I think tears. And I drew some tears.
That's what I wrote too. And just that, you know, crying. Yeah.
I wrote change. I think a lot of times, obviously, it's a sense of a loss, but that invariably often means change. And that's hard at baseline on top of, you know, what the reality of is causing the grief might mean. So for me, I think a lot around just living with change.
Yeah.
I think I wrote the more traditional sense. I recently lost my grandfather who meant the world to me, so I put his name down. And then, but I also took it as a self-reflection, and this is not one word. I got a lot of words, but my old carefree self. I think there's some grief there as well.
Mhm.
Andrea, I put the same thing down.
Did you?
I did. I put down the words breast cancer and grieving the freeness that I felt like I used to have, just because breast cancer is definitely something I think about daily. Not necessarily in a negative context, but obviously I've got to take medication every day, and there's just things I'm very aware of that are heavier than prior to breast cancer, obviously. And along those lines, yesterday I had a very great conversation with Natalie, who went in for her double mastectomy today. And I was recalling a lot. I've been journaling a lot in the last 24 hours about how I felt when I lost my breasts, just grieving that the intimate self, my body, the change. So I think that goes along what Wendy said, like it's synonymous with change. I think is hard sometimes to accept.
I wrote down void because I feel like grief is the loss of somebody or something, and there's a void now. So that's what I wrote.
Yeah. All really powerful words and statements. Anyone else want to share before we move on? Okay. So the question then, can grief and gratitude coexist in our hearts and everyday life? And what if we identified our grief, small and big, as a normal part of human existence? And here is, an example. COVID, the pandemic has kind of given us a pretty common example of how we've all suffered some loss in different degrees over the past 2 years at this point. And just thought it'd be interesting to share the perspective on lost there, and how some of the principles that they talk about here can be applicable to any and all grief. Just using COVID as an example, just because it's right here, right now. We'll just take a listen.
Joan, I'm also wondering, I know working with a lot of clients and even friends texting me, is this normal that I feel this way? And I'm hearing a lot of grief. I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are. A lot of people also might not understand it as grief, right? People might have traditional views of what grief looks like. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, because there's a known process of how we go through crises. A crisis is really a rite of passage from one thing to the next. And it begins when the ground underneath you opens up. And that's really what's happened. It's like, wait a minute, where's my life? Everything's gone. And that's stage one. It's called separation from life as usual. The second stage of getting through a period like this is you're in a place of uncertainty. This is a long process, and we don't know when the end is. Pardon me. This is called liminal space, the time between what was and what is no longer and what is not yet. And the first part of liminal time is grieving what's lost. This is what's expected to happen when you begin to realize, oh my God, I'm grieving. There's so many things for people to grieve. To grieve the loss of income is very important. We have family who right now are in a position that they need loans in order to feed their children. And that, as a parent, is an incredibly grievous thing to feel. like, wait a minute, I thought I'd planned well. I've got a little emergency fund, but it's not going to last that long when I can't pay my mortgage. And people, it's normal to grieve, and you really need to let yourself be with those feelings. Or, I mean, my God, the grief I think so many of us have for not only our own family who might be ill, but just watching what's happening in New York. For me, I found the grief of people dying alone was almost overwhelming. My daughter-in-law ended up in the hospital for like 11 days, not with COVID, but with emergency surgery in another country, in Costa Rica. And the thought that I could not be there by her side was truly overwhelming. And then grief recruits grief. My grief over not being able to be there for her grafted on to the grief of people who actually have to die alone. And then the heroism of healthcare providers using their own smartphones so that people could somehow say goodbye to their family. There's plenty of grief to go around. And I think it's a very normal part of this. So you have to let yourself feel it. And then at the same time, you have to keep saying, okay, this grief is there. I accept that it's there. What can I do? Some self-compassionate act to feel better here. And we keep going. And it's just part of the natural process. And if we don't grieve, we don't grieve. This is, I'm a scientist, but what I'm going to say is kind of not so scientific, but the grief gets stuck in the body. And we end up with chronic stress and illness as a result of not allowing ourselves to grieve. So we have every reason for it, natural part of the landscape. And people should feel, yes, it's okay to grieve.
I think it's powerful for us as therapists to remind our patients it is okay to feel exactly how you feel, right? Especially when we get those mixed messages. Rick, do you have any last thoughts about grief and anything that you want to share?
In Tibet, there's an expression, the 8 worldly winds. You may know the phrase, pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame, and fame and ill repute. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about gain and loss. And for example, our son, who'd been living with us, moved out about a week ago into an apartment nearby. And my own grief about that was very palpable. I was teary the whole time. I would see pictures of him when he and I were together when he was like 10 years old. We were goofing around. And it just hit me hard because it's going to be many, many months probably before I hug him again, just because I'm being prudent and I'm a high risk group and I'm thoughtful about what I might get and then pass on to someone else. And that's a loss. On the other hand, there's a gain. Our daughter moved in from New York. She'd been sheltering in place in Greenwich Village, probably had COVID-19, is on the other side of it, and now she's in quarantine here with us. So there have been so many losses and gains as well. And I think about what cannot be lost truly, our underlying true nature, underlying qualities we cultivated over time, the bonds that we actually have with others, the things that have occurred that will never not have been. And I think this is a time where we have to accept losses, including a kind of loss of innocence, perhaps as a country, while at the same time really appreciating what we're gaining from this, including the things that we're learning how to deal with. They don't take away from the losses, but they're alongside the losses. And also to have our attention drawn to what can never be lost, but what can be found.
So the idea there really is not so much COVID, but just those principles about really having simultaneous feelings at the same time and making time for each of them. Having that macro and those micro grieving elements of life are just a natural part of life, some bigger, some smaller, obviously. And so just a quick kind of question, does anyone identify with the feeling of being conditioned to move on quickly, making little to no time to pause or honor feelings around loss? Does that seem like you can just raise your hand, feel like a common kind of thread that you've been kind of conditioned to? Yeah. So things we commonly grieve, but often don't make time to grieve, can include things like loss of dreams, loss of time, loss of self-esteem, loss of feelings of safety, loss of confidence, loss of enthusiasm, loss of relationships, and of course, loss of loved ones. And so now I just invite you to write something down in your journal, maybe one thing that you feel like you may have lost during the pandemic or even in the past year. It's up to you. Just a loss, something that you may have lost. And we'll take about a minute to do that. Would anyone like to share? Would anyone like to name it to tame it? Take the sharp edge off, kind of. Okay, Stacy, go ahead.
I mean, there were many, I don't know if it was just the pandemic or it had been something else, but they happened simultaneously. But I definitely feel I lost myself. And with that, I had been dancing and I stopped dancing, so became out of shape. Where's my career? What am I doing now? What are the connections? Like, you lose those connections that you had fostered to try to get somewhere, whatever that where is. And yeah, I definitely lost those for me.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to share?
I know for me, when I found out I had breast cancer and then found out a few days later I was 7 weeks pregnant, I felt the loss of community. When I was pregnant with my first daughter, we could meet up with new moms and go to story time at the library and Barnes and Noble freely and not be paranoid of catching COVID. But when he was born, we didn't have that. Lincoln and I didn't have a place to go and meet new families with newborns and new moms with newborns. And I think that's so integral for new moms, just to be out of the house and meet parents who are experiencing the same happiness, the same sadness, the same feelings. So that was a loss for Lincoln and I when he was born. And I enjoyed it so much when Tess was born almost 4 years ago. And I held on to that grief for a while because I wanted that for us to. I mean, I love story time, going to the library, even though it was only for 30 minutes, it was so nice just to see other people like me in the same space, in the same place. and just chat. Even if they weren't going to be my friends, they were still the same people who shared the same feelings like myself. So community loss in that space was something that I felt for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like I lost time. I was diagnosed during the pandemic, so I went through chemo and I had to be hyper vigilant, obviously. And I have young nieces and nephews who I just couldn't see. So I lost almost like a year of their life. And to be a part of that, and I lost time with my parents. I didn't get to see them for over a year, and just like family celebrations, all just time, lost time.
Mhm.
I think for me, it's been like a combination of the pandemic and then getting diagnosed and going through chemo, but just I've lost like my creative drive and motivation. I mean, I am a writer and an author, and I was, before all of this, had so many goals and thoughts and ideas, and it just all got depleted. Like the pandemic started it, and then it was this past 6 months or 8 months, it's just like every motivation I had to be creatively energized is just like, it's like a balloon. Like I could just feel it's like flat, you know? And I don't know where you get, you know, I don't know where that comes back or when that comes back.
Erin, I'm also a writer. It comes back.
Okay.
I promise you, it does. Just takes a little time, but it does come back.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Mine is very similar. Since I've been working from home every day, I have lost all the motivation to go exercise. I'm like, I don't want to get out of my pajamas, you know, and I only have 2 small video meetings, but you know, we don't have to dress up or anything. So I have not joined the gym yet, but I have plans to change that. And on the flip side, the opposite side of grief, tomorrow is my last chemo. And so I'm on cloud 9. And then the next week is my birthday. So I'm going to get back to the gym. I'm going to be done with chemo, but I have reconstruction sometime this spring. But I don't know. That's the opposite of grief for me.
Yeah, they sound like fresh starts, right?
Yes, fresh starts.
Well, thank you. Is anyone, did we miss anyone that wanted to share? Thank you, everyone who did. That was very brave. And, you know, the idea of grieving losses, big and small, it's important, and it's been researched, obviously. And it, you know, some of the great research says it frees up some of this energy that's bound to the lost person or object or experience when we give time to pause and kind of even just say it out loud or honor it or scream it, you know, in the woods or wherever you need to. And when we make time for that grief, we are able to reinvest that energy elsewhere, right? So until we grieve effectively, we're likely to find this reinvesting that energy kind of difficult. So part of us can kind of remain tied to that past or that loss, right? So I guess the next 2 questions are, do you think you allow time to for that pause, that process, that honoring of those feelings around grief? That there's a great quote from Dr. Prochaska in his book, Changing to Thrive, that says, healthy thinking supports healthy behavior. So when we can free ourselves of, and not to say that grief is negative, right? It's something, it's intrinsic to our being, but when we push it down and push it away and leave it for another time, I think that's when it starts to become kind of stuck, for lack of a better word, to quote the psychologist earlier. So how many of you think you allow that time, right? Does anyone feel really good about how much time they grieve? Or that would be a question too. If you feel like you've got it down, please share, because that we will all learn from you.
No, I was gonna say the opposite. I feel like I've given time to things, but then why does it keep coming back? You know, like why does it keep coming? So then clearly I didn't give it enough time. So no, I don't have an answer.
Right, right. And that begs the question, how much time is enough time, right? And I think that's where it's really personal, and that's really a hard question to answer. How much time is enough time? And maybe it just becomes part of our common thread of humanity, as opposed to something we're trying to finish. Just,
I was
just
gonna
questions.
too, just to tack on to that, it's Wendy talking. I agree. Not only do I not give myself that time, but I think I compound it with like self-criticism, like I don't know if criticism is the right word, but I'm hard on myself. Like you should move on. You should be over this by now. I kind of beat myself up, and that just kind of makes it worse. When in reality, obviously these things might take time and last a long time, and so, but the compounding of sort of beating myself up makes it all harder.
Right. So giving yourself permission to not criticize, number one, but also to not have a timeline for it, right? Even though it gets old, maybe that narrative, and you want to be done with it, right? So when we think about how our culture and other cultures mourn the loss of a life, right? So that's just, when it's the most common thing that people grieve is the loss of a life. We can start to understand too, it's really interesting to study how we may have been conditioned to grieve. And so in the US, there's viewings and funerals and memorial services, and people wear black. But traditionally the mourning period's pretty quick, right? I mean, in a group setting. Right. So once you kind of go through those things, then what? Right. It's over. Right. We went to the funeral last week. Right. So it's interesting when you think of loss and mourning and grief, and how we've been conditioned to look at it. Right. So we're almost going against the tide here by saying, no, let it in. In Israel, they sit Shiva for these 10 days. They turn mirrors around. China, they wear cloth armbands for up to 100 days. Brazil and Thailand, they wear purple and black. South Africa, red is the color of mourning. And in Eastern Asia, white mourning cloths are worn to symbolize purity and rebirth. And I thought this was interesting. In Italy, the mourning is expected to last 1 year. And widows are expected to wear black for a long time when they're mourning, which is, interesting when we think about it. And I just pulled this because I thought it was really interesting. In Papua New Guinea, so gray is the color that comes from this stone clay that women apply to their skin after the death of their husband. And as seen in the picture, this woman is also wearing loops of gray grass seeds. And so every day a woman removes one of the necklaces, and the mourning ends when the last loop is taken off, usually 9 months, right? So that's a dedicated time, right? So it's really interesting. This woman pictured has a few necklaces on, suggesting she's nearing the end of her, I guess, public mourning period, right? And so I guess the idea here is, how do we mourn publicly? And then what does that say about how we're conditioned to mourn privately? Just my opinion, but it does feel like we're expected to tidy things up pretty quickly around here. So it kind of also begs the question, we have rituals around big loss like death, but what about the other losses we experience through life? What if we looked at all of our loss, big and small, and honored them in a similar, beautiful way? What would that look like? And so there was a study done by this Dr. Boy, and he found that so when you think about grief, sometimes people associate it with great stress, right? And stress can be an ambiguous word because it can mean very different things to very different people, to many people. But there's a study that specially designed 8-week mind-body program that helped reduce the stress in older adults who have lost a spouse. And so the idea here again is that if we take some of these components that we've dedicated to a loss around a person, what if we took some of these components and applied them to the daily losses that we feel, those daily griefs, those big and small griefs? And so it was interesting, the yoga, the Tai Chi, maintaining the healthy diet. So these are the components of the program. Follow a good sleep hygiene program, which I love to talk about. Get moving, the keeping tabs on your health, right? So it's easy to ignore your general health stuff, and you got to keep those exams going and keep those physicals going. And then the support, reaching out to your social circle, which I know some of you are really good at doing. And this was a great quote, I thought, that know that when you've been covered in darkness, you've been planted. Reach for the light, you are growing. And so I thought we could get our journals out again and go back to what you wrote down as your pandemic loss, or the loss that you felt. And now write down one thing you have done to reach for the light. So this is where we kind of think about things living kind of simultaneous, gratitude, grief, kind of together. So you honor and we acknowledge the loss. And then what's one thing you have done to reach for the light or to ease some of that pain? And we'll take about a minute. Okay, does anyone want to share about a way they have reached for the light, or they have tried to ease their pain, or ease that loss?
I'll go. Thanks to remote work. So mine was time. But thanks to remote working, I can work basically anywhere. So what I have done is I've spent quite a bit of time going to my sister's house so I can spend time with my niece and nephew in ways that I wouldn't be able to normally. So I get to be a part of their like regular life as opposed to just coming to visit, which is really kind of nice. And I wouldn't have that if it wasn't for remote working and the pandemic.
I love your creativity.
Thanks, COVID.
Anybody else want to share how they reached for the light, or they found the light? A light, any light, just a glimmer?
There's always a silver lining, I feel, in anything. And I think the pandemic has made me spend more time with my children and my husband, whereas normally we're running here and running there. And so we made meals together and we did a lot of things together. And it was extra time. My youngest went off to college in fall of 2020. And so it was like the last few months with him before he went away, because he's away now and I miss him. So that would be my light.
Yeah.
I would say, Zoom. I took Zoom classes. I was finding ways to meet and be with people, maybe along the same lines everyone is saying, that allowed for me to like be at this meeting, right? Everybody's everywhere. And it saves me time for travel, or, like those things that I can be spent at home. So yeah, Zoom did keep me connected in ways, but not the way I traditionally thought. In new ways. I'll go. I got, I think along the same lines as what's been already mentioned, that I've spent a lot of time with my family. I've kind of leaned into the opportunity to just hang out more with my kids. We play a lot of board games, a lot of cards. So that's been really fun. And also doing like little household projects that I never have time to do. So I've just kept myself busy and creative doing those sorts of things, which has been nice because I can kind of it almost becomes meditative, right? Like if I'm painting or I'm working on like a craft project or something like that, or sewing, it's just, it's just me and my thoughts and what I'm doing. And I wouldn't have had time necessarily to do that otherwise because I'd be running around and driving from here to there, commuting or whatever. So from that perspective, it's given me time.
Yeah.
I have two. Something I learned through my current chemo treatment is to take time to rest when your body needs to rest. And so since I have been working from home, I have lots of computer time and not commute time. And so I literally block my calendar for an hour during the day and literally take a nap. My body needs it, and rest is medicine. And so I don't feel guilty at all doing it. And so rest when you need to. And another thing I've also learned is the importance of helping other people out, even when they don't specifically ask for help. I mean, during chemo, we've had so many neighbors, friends, whatever, reach out to us and say, hey, I'm bringing you dinner tonight. Pick a restaurant in town and I want to bring it to you. And we didn't ask for that, but it was a great gesture. And it's something that I want to return and do the same for other people when I notice that, they could use a helping hand.
Thank you for sharing that. Also, great examples of how grief and gratitude can kind of live together when we say it out loud. So here are some other ways, right, to kind of shine some of that light. We talked about identifying those feelings. They are unique to you, saying them out loud, name it to tame it. Naming an emotion allows us to pause and use our breath to calm our physiology, take us from fight or flight state to one where that frontal lobe has a chance to kick into action and bring some sense to the situation. Allow it in, invite it, just like Rumi and his guest house suggests. Dance with it and not wrestle with it. Incorporate nostalgia, which I think Jillian mentioned and a few others, playing a board game. And in terms of the pandemic, we tried to start playing games that we played before the pandemic hit to say, okay, let's bring some of that back in. And we even expanded it over Zoom to relatives in Ireland. We're like, hey, get on, we can play this together now, which we never would have thought of. And then finding support, carrying or wearing a linking object or a keepsake that symbolically reminds you of your loss. And then you can anticipate a time when no longer need to carry it or not. You can carry it for as long as you want. Tell those around you what helps and what doesn't. Most people would like to know, would like to help if they knew how, right? So just some other ways to kind of shine the light. And I love this, the ABCs of self-care when you're dealing with grief, right? So these are just some really fun way to kind of remember how to be kind to yourself. And this will be recorded, so you can come back to this if you'd like. And so here's where we go to gratitude and how we move. So one way to bridge that gap between grief and peace is the practice of gratitude. And so gratitude, of course, can be defined as a warm feeling of thankfulness towards the world or specific people. A person who feels gratitude is thankful for what they have and does not constantly seek more, right? And it can be expressed and practiced in ways that are unique to each person. And so there's many of you probably have examples of gratitude practices. There's journals, there's volunteering, meditation. I love this jolt examples. Just I was reading about a woman who lost a son, and she talked about this acronym of jolt, just one little thing a day. She would just seek to find one little thing a day she was grateful for, big or small. And this is also where self-compassion comes in. So for today, we'll specifically explore gratitude in the form of honoring yourself through the practice of self-compassion. So Dr. Kristen Neff, I'm not sure if any of you have heard of her, but she's recognized as one of the world's experts in the study of self-compassion. And she defines self-compassion as giving ourselves the kindness and care we would give to a good friend, a form of self-acceptance. So it can also be this openness, this experiencing the full range of human emotions so that they are acknowledged and honored without suppression, without avoidance, exaggeration, or rumination. So it's this non-judgmental and observational approach to your own thoughts and feelings. And I love this from Susan David. She's a great psychologist, and she really breaks it down. Sympathy is, I'm sorry you're in pain, is kind of a distant emotion. Empathy, I can imagine what this pain feels like. That's kind of shared. And then compassion, you are suffering and I will do what I can to help. That's the connected and the action oriented. So here is Dr. Neff kind of talking about these three components of self-compassion. We'll just listen to a little bit of what she has to say.
So how do I define self-compassion then? I really don't see a difference between compassion for self and others. I define them the exact same way. I argue that self-compassion has the components of a sense of kindness, care, understanding for yourself versus judgment, a sense of common humanity versus feeling isolated and cut off from others. And then a sense of mindfulness, right? Being aware of the suffering that's occurring versus over-identification, which again, I'll just clarify this in one moment. Let's go through each one separately. Okay, so self-kindness versus self-judgment. Kindness is more than just hearts and flowers, okay? Kindness has a very active component to it. It means when you're kind to yourself, really want to comfort yourself when you're suffering. You want to alleviate your suffering. You want to soothe yourself. Okay, it's a very active stance where I want to do whatever I can to help myself feel as good as possible in this moment. Okay. Common humanity, really framing one's own experience in light of the common human experience. It's very funny if I were to ask any of you, are a human being? Are you a human being? Yes, of course. Is everyone else a human being? Yes, of course. Does everyone else suffer? Yes, of course. You would say that logically, but in the moment when you just blew it at work, or you had someone reject you, or something really bad happens in your life, what happens non-rationally is that we get very egocentric. We feel like, why me? This somehow has happened to me. I'm the only one who's messed up. I'm the only one who's going through that difficult time. And we feel really cut off from others. It's as if somehow when things go wrong, that's abnormal. This is not supposed to be this way. Something has gone wrong. But is that the case? Has anything gone wrong? Is anything abnormal? No. That's what life is. Life goes wrong. No one in here signed a contract were, born in this world saying I would be perfect, my life would be perfect, and yet it's like, this is not the plan I signed up for. I'm pissed off about it, right? That's how we react. The problem with that, and there's a lot of problems with that, but one of the main things is when we feel isolated and cut off from others, physiologically, that's very frightening. If you think evolutionarily, one of the worst things that can happen to us is to be isolated from the group, because then we aren't safe. And it's interesting, this aspect of well-being, I don't think has been studied enough. The sense of, can we feel connected to others in our suffering, or do we feel isolated from others in our suffering? And just, I can tell you in the workshops I've conducted, especially the 8-week ones, at the end, I asked people what they got out of this the most. Almost every single person says common humanity. I realize it's not just me. It's not just me who judges myself. It's not just me who suffers like this. Very important to remember that this is human experience. This is how things are supposed to be. Nothing has gone wrong. Yes, it's painful, but it's normal. It's natural. And then this is where the mindfulness comes in. You have to be aware of your suffering in order to give it compassion. So mindfulness allows you not only to notice your suffering, but very important, we'll talk about this more, to be with your suffering as it is. We don't like to be around suffering. If we could just get rid of pain, we'd do it. And we have lots of psychological mechanisms to avoid that, again, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. So self-compassion says, wow, pain is occurring. Can I turn toward that? Can I be with that? And you actually need to do that to be able to give yourself the caring and support you need. Right? Now, some people do say, come on, you have to notice your suffering. Isn't it like blindingly obvious I'm suffering? But it's often really not. The pain caused by self-judgment, I think in some ways that's some of the worst pain all of us experience. Constant, niggly pain. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not this enough. I blew it. I'm this, I'm that. But often we're so lost in the role of self-critic, we don't really stop to realize, oh my God, this is really, really hurting. And in some ways it feels more comfortable to be the self-critic, because at least the self-critic isn't the person that messed up. The self-critic knows you messed up. The part of you that feels really, vulnerable and insecure and a failure, often we don't give that side of the process as much attention. Okay. Then also very important, when things go wrong in our lives, very often we go straight into problem-solving mode. It's like, there's a problem. I don't want there to be a problem. Need to fix the problem, immediately. And what happens is we go straight into problem-solving mode and don't stop to, again, turn towards the suffering and say, whew, this is really hard. This is difficult. I need a little care and compassion to get me through this. And we really aren't at our best and our most psychologically stable when we go towards trying to fix that problem. Okay, so it's actually something you have to remind yourself to do before going straight into fixing problems, to just acknowledge and validate how difficult the situation is.
So just to review, these are the 3 components that Dr. Neff talks about: that self-kindness, self-judgment, the mindfulness versus over-identification, the common humanity versus the isolation. And so really another question here for your journal. What are your roadblocks to practicing self-compassion? Are there roadblocks? Do you feel like there's anything kind of screaming in your face that says, no to you, no self-compassion for you, not today? So really we'll just take 30 seconds. And if anything comes to mind, go ahead and jot that down. And this is something you can come back to and say, why the roadblock, right? And what can I do about that roadblock? And Dr. Neff talks about these roadblocks in another TED talk, but we'll pass over that for right now, just in the interest of time. And we'll talk about some of the benefits that self-compassion yields, right? And so there's this positive association with happiness, optimism, positive affect, wisdom, personal initiative, curiosity, exploration. They're endless, right? When we give ourselves that self-compassion. And there's, a reduction in anxiety and related depression when we take that time for self-compassion. Dr. Neff says the practice of self-compassion can help us avoid the trappings of self-limiting or destructive thought processes. So that's that gremlin, that inner talk that diminishes our motivation or initiative. Her research shows that self-compassion can reduce anxiety and actually help us make real changes in our lives. And so here, these is her thought process in supporting self-compassion. We mindfully accept that the moment is painful, embrace it with kindness and care, remembering that imperfection is part of the shared human experience. And then she goes on to say that when people start a practice around self-compassion, whether it's 5 minutes in the morning or however you decide, their pain actually increases at first. And they call that backdraft phenomena, which is a firefighting term that happens when a door in a burning house is opened, right? You've opened. So sometimes that pain can increase when we turn towards the pain a little bit. And then I love how she says we have to allow ourselves to be slow learners when it comes to practicing self-compassion. So again, go easy on yourself, right? When trying to incorporate something new, or when you're taking a minute to pet your animal, or to just spend time with your dog when you feel like your to-do list is nagging at you. So if we could, and if anyone feels inspired, identify in your journal just one way maybe you'd like to start practicing the self-compassion, like one little thing you could do, or one shift that you may like to make. And we can do about 30 seconds for that. Again, here are some of the ABCs just to give you some ideas if you're thinking, how can I start to show myself some more self-compassion? If nothing's coming to your brain, here's a cheat sheet, so to speak. And there's no right or wrong answer here, obviously. So Kristen Neff also has this self-compassion test online if anyone is really feeling compelled to, think about how they practice self-compassion. And then there's this little exercise I thought we could hear. So the idea is to really take a minute and think about a situation in life that's causing you distress or stress right now. Call the situation to mind and see if you can actually feel the stress or the discomfort, right? So kind of connect with that. And say to yourself, this is a moment of suffering. And other options include this hurts, ouch, this is stress. And that's that mindfulness that Dr. Neff talks about. And then the second part of this is now say suffering is part of life. Other people feel this way. I'm not alone. That's that common humanity, right? It doesn't take away from your suffering. It just puts those words out. Makes you not feel so isolated is the goal. And then now put your hands over your heart and feel the warmth of your hands and the gentle touch of your hands on your chest. And say to yourself, may I be kind to myself. You can also ask yourself, what do I need to hear right now to express kindness? Anything will work here. And then there's a fourth step. You can ask yourself, what do I need right now to express kindness to myself? Are there words you could speak to yourself? Like, may I accept myself just as I am in this moment? May I be patient? May I slow down a little and breathe? And an action step such as taking a bath or going for a walk or meditating, something, calling a friend. This is that self-kindness again. And so that's just one exercise you can do to kind of really evoke that self-compassion that we know we all have deep down inside. And so at the end of this, I hope that it is clear the common thread here is connection, right? So when we honor grief, we're connecting with our loss. When we practice gratitude, we're connecting us to what we are thankful for. We are using that. And then when we utilize self-compassion, we're connecting to ourself. And we're really having, the ability to have an honest appraisal of ourself when we are connecting. And so here's a chance to use your journal again and think about a SMART goal in terms of grief and self-compassion. Is there a way, and you can use what you wrote down before, that you'd want to shift or make a change, or just a thought when it comes to your grief, gratitude, and self-compassion? And when we first started talking, a few weeks ago, we talked about at the end of this program, we'll have these SMART goals all kind of related to each kind of topic. And so here's the chance to write something down that if there was anything you want to remember from today, now's kind of the time to write it down and kind of make a goal around it if you feel so empowered to do that. There's no pressure to write a SMART goal around it, but if you do feel that inclination, now is the time. And we'll take about 30 seconds for that. Okay. And this is something obviously you can certainly come back to as you move forward. These are my favorites. If you're interested in more on the topic, some of these podcasts are really great. One of my favorites is Being Well, and this Being with Grief with Dr. Cacciatore. And then of course there's Dr. Neff's website as well. And then just a show of hands, has anyone heard of the On Being Project? It's at the bottom, Krista Tippett's. I think it began on NPR, but now it's I think you can access it on Apple Podcasts. But has anyone heard of the On Being Project? No. Okay. It's a really beautiful podcast and e-newsletter that I encourage you all to take a look at whenever you get the chance. This intersection of spiritual inquiry, science, social healing, and the arts. I feel like there's something for everybody. Does anyone have any questions or anything they'd like to share before we go today? This is one of my favorites. That I like to remind myself: new approach to self-care, talk to myself the same way I talk to my dogs. Hey, sweet girl, look at that beautiful belly. You're so clever. Want a treat? So I encourage that kind of self-talk whenever you get a chance. But does anyone have anything they want to share before we go, or any questions or thoughts, or anyone have a goal they want to just shout out and put it out there in the universe just so it's out there in terms of self-compassion or grief? Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for sharing and being brave. I'm going to blow out my candle now as the close of our session comes to an end, and wish you all well till the next time we meet.
Thank you, Jennifer, as always.
Yeah, thank you.
So insightful. Really appreciate you and all you bring. I will share the video of this with everyone
Great.
once it loads to the, I don't know, cloud or whatever.
Cloud, yeah. Awesome.
That thing up there. All right. Thank
Awesome.
you. Bye,
Okay,
everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Good week.